YouTube personality Miles Kasiri of Healthy Crazy Cool has just flat out lied to his fans in his recent video on trans athletes. Not only did he lie about the science, but in doing so lent credibility to misuse to police all women's bodies, not to forget acts that constitute human rights violations on not one, not two, but at least 7 counts. I wish I were exaggerating. Coincidentally, I'm already working on a series covering the history and pseudoscience behind sex testing and gender policing in sport, as well as the ethics behind said practices and the very philosophy of fairness via discrimination that has come to define the conversation. And it's coming along, it's getting there. And let me tell you, the one emotion I feel when working on the topic and looking at how sports arrived at the state it has today, more than anything else, is pure, unutterable rage. But seeing as that series will take a while to complete, Miles offers me an opportunity to let off some steam whilst giving you all a taste of what's to come. Yet before I can do that, I just need to give a content warning for the following topics: transphobia, interphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, racism, misogyny, sexual harassment, rape and sexual assault, colonialism, violation of medical consent, fascism, and attempted suicide. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media like Twitter and Discord. So let's start with the science, as I know a lot of people are going to have difficulty taking me seriously unless I can refute Miles's mountain of evidence. Oh, did I say mountain of evidence? I meant this one anecdote.
Let me give you a little example. So basically, back in the day when I was 17, I was competing in professional tennis. I was still in the junior division because I was 18 and under. And I was one of the best juniors in the world, yes, but we're not even talking about the senior males yet at this point. And I was lucky enough to spend, I think it was about 5 or 6 days training and competing with Serena Williams. Yes, the one and only Serena Williams, who is probably the best female athlete of all time, definitely the best female tennis player of all time, and someone that I look up to, respect. There was such a big difference in every aspect: speed, strength, endurance. And to be honest, even as a 17-year-old, it wasn't even that hard for me to pretty comfortably beat the best female tennis player in the world, who was #1 in the world at that point, winning all of the Grand Slams. In fact, she'd just come back from winning the Australian Open pretty easily at that as well. That is really where my passion for this subject comes from. And also just understanding basic human biology, which I feel like you don't really need to even understand to understand that what is going on now is completely unfair. Yes, there are certain political speakers online that have spoken about this for a while and just the injustice of the situation as this madness has panned out. Not speaking up for what's right just out of fear is something that I can't fuck with. So, here we go.
I'll take shit that never happened for £1,000. Either that, or perhaps the adult in the situation gave you a pity win so not as to hurt your inflated male ego. But yeah, that's the sole piece of evidence Miles supplies as validation of his position: an anecdote. Anecdotes can never be evidence as they ignore the existence of outliers and anomalies, not to mention they're often unverifiable, see previous. In short, they're not science of any kind, let alone biology. Not that Miles will let the facts get in the way of his prejudice.
When you grow up as a biological male, you have so many more advantages than a biological female. The list goes on and on and on. It doesn't matter what you identify as when you're older or when you're transitioning. If you have spent the majority of your life, let's say you've spent 18 years of your life, 20 years of your life, 25 years of your life, which in some of these cases, you know, the people that are transitioning in sport, they're in their 30s and 40s. They've lived their life as a biological male for 30 to 40 years of their life. With the exposure of that amount of testosterone, then they identify as women and are allowed to compete against biological women. If you grow up as a biological male, you are exposed to much more testosterone than a biological female. Now, this comes with all the advantages of increased muscle mass, denser bones, narrower hips, larger lung capacity, bigger heart, more red blood cells, and also the lack of having to deal with menstruation every single month. Additionally to that, the growth plates of biological females close way before biological males. It doesn't matter whether you take testosterone blockers or not, okay? I think one thing that people don't understand is that testosterone blockers do not reverse how you grew up. If you spend 18, 20, 25, 30 years in a biological male body with the exposure of that much testosterone, testosterone blockers will not turn you into a biological female. They will just halt further progression. Even if you take estrogen, you are still going to have a massive physical advantage. Just because you take testosterone blockers, it does not undo all of those years of advantages that you had to progress into the physical body that you are now competing with, which is a massive advantage in pretty much every single situation. If it's a sport that involves speed, strength, endurance, you are going to have an advantage. Fact. I don't think anyone can deny with that. And anyone that does is in denial. Like, very, very bad denial. Again, so many people just sit here and watch in silence because they just don't want to get involved. They don't want to get hate. They don't want to be told that they're not being inclusive. This is not about being inclusive. This is about obvious fairness. It's not a grey area. It's black and it's white. If we're talking about a sport that has nothing to do with speed, strength, or endurance, speed, strength, or endurance, such as, I don't know, darts, or like snooker or pool, fair enough, maybe. But if it is anything to do with strength, endurance, or speed, anyone that grew up in a biologically male body with that amount of testosterone, you are going to have a massive advantage. And this has been shown to us. This is not me speculating, this is a fact.
Why do transphobes always say that blood isn't changed by HRT? Well, I know why. It's because some specialists have speculated that blood, specifically the hemoglobin in the blood, might be the number one advantage cis men have over cis women. So naturally, that's something transphobes have to jump on without question. Which is strange because most people understand that blood is something our bodies are constantly replacing throughout our lives. You don't die with the same blood you were born with, meaning that changes in a person's hormones at any point throughout their life can have an impact. That's why decreasing levels of testosterone in elderly people, both men and women, correlate with anemia. And wouldn't you know it, the impact hormones have on blood also extends to trans women, despite Miles's personal incredulity. Though Miles really should have caught on. After all, if HRT doesn't change anything, it just prevents any further changes caused by testosterone during puberty, why then do full-grown adults take HRT? It should be a complete waste of money for them if what Miles asserted here was true. But we've gotten ahead of ourselves. We're assuming that testosterone gives cis men an advantage over cis women to begin with, but research has found that 25% of elite male athletes in 12 out of 15 sports had innate testosterone levels below what World Athletics considered the lower limit for men. To tie that to what Miles claimed about strength and endurance, said sports included powerlifting, running, ice hockey, and rowing, both explosive and endurance sports. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the studies I'll be showing you in a second. But returning to the bedrock of Miles's position, the belief that testosterone is the master molecule when it comes to athletics is not unique to him. It's an old idea that first gained prominence during the Cold War. Long story short, the US was getting its ass handed to it at the Olympics and decided to accuse the Soviets of cheating. And they did so in two ways. They accused the Soviets of sneaking men into women's teams and of doping women with testosterone. This is in spite of the fact that there was zero evidence to support any of this. But hey, the US was desperate to uphold the lie of American exceptionalism. Sadly, the lie that testosterone is primarily responsible for the gender gap in athletics stuck around even after the Berlin Wall had crumbled and hasn't gone away since, in spite of the fact that there hasn't been a single study to date that has shown a positive correlation between testosterone and athletic prowess, let alone a causal link. Not that athletic institutions haven't attempted to forge one. World Athletics, or the WA, formerly the International Amateur Athletic Federation, is an institution responsible for setting international standards on sports participation, and even has a hand in setting these standards, followed by the International Olympic Committee, more commonly known as the IOC. As such, they are seen to be the gold standard. So surely they must have justification for their policies on testosterone. Well, following their barring of intersex athlete Dutty Chan from competing in several sporting events in 2014 due to her having hyperandrogenism, she took their asses to court, specifically the Court of Arbitration for Sports, and won. To quote the ruling,
in the absence of such evidence, the panel is unable to conclude that hyperandrogenic female athletes may enjoy such a significant performance advantage that it is necessary to exclude them from competing in the female category.
In plain speak, the WA had no evidence that women with higher levels of testosterone than is considered typical had any sort of athletic advantage over other women. As a result, the CAS suspended the WA's regulations as of July 2015, giving them 2 years to show evidence of their claims. What followed was a complete shit show. Instead of justifying their current restrictions, the WA came back in 2018 and tried to enforce even stricter ones, falling back on a journal article published by the director of the Health and Science Department at World Athletics, Dr. Stefan Beaumont, in 2017. The problem? The study was so deeply flawed methodologically that those reviewing it demanded its immediate withdrawal. So Dr. Berman came back with a second study, only this time the results were completely different, the data likely flawed, and what's really funny is that the strongest correlation it showed was a negative correlation between testosterone and athletic performance. That's to say, athletes in events favouring low testosterone had a 5.4% performance increase, whilst those in events favouring high testosterone saw a meagre 2.9% performance increase. Yet nobody is here arguing that men and women with low testosterone need to have theirs increased, because this is not about fairness. It's about dictating what it means to be a woman by upholding the mythology surrounding testosterone. Unsurprisingly, an independent report found deep methodological issues with both papers, concluding that
the results of Study 1 are clearly unreliable and those of Study 2 are of unknown validity. Further, without access to the medical data and all linked performances used in Study 1, it is impossible to know how and why certain athletes or results were removed and others not. What is unequivocal is that Study 1 used unreliable data and thus its results are also unreliable. Different data and methods were used in Study 2, leading to significantly different results based on the almost certain use of flawed data, leading consequently to unreliable results. The bottom line is that the use of flawed data makes it impossible to know what, if any, relationship exists between the variables of Study 1 and Study 2, or to verify the reported results.
That's the only evidence that exists to support any sort of correlation between innate testosterone levels and athletic prowess. Meanwhile, we have multiple studies that not only show there to be no correlation, but a negative one. As mentioned previously, 25% of elite male athletes have testosterone below what World Athletics considers the lower limit for men, a fact that seems to have zero impact on their ability. And it's not the only problematic piece of evidence that exists, with multiple studies that have not been brought into question due to data tampering showing the same for weightlifters and cyclists. Point is, the belief that testosterone is the deciding factor when it comes to sport has no scientific basis. It is a pseudoscientific relic that simply refuses to die. What that also means is that the limits set by the WA, and subsequently the IOC, on both trans and intersex women are garbage. They don't prove anything other than the fact that sexism in sports is very much an institutional problem. That's why during the Olympics this year, the IOC's own medical and science director, Dr. Richard Budgett, came forward and admitted the following about the restrictions put on trans women by the WA.
I absolutely accept that things move on. At the time, the 10 nanomoles per liter was set because we thought that was the lower level for men. We now know that they go down to 7 and women can be higher as well. Agreeing on another number is almost impossible and possibly irrelevant. You can debate that endlessly.
What Miles keeps asserting as a solid fact is really a myth that's starting to crumble. But that begs the question, if differences in testosterone levels aren't responsible, why then is there a gender gap in sports? Well, I'm glad you asked. How about we look at some bones? Preservation of volumetric bone density and geometry in trans women during cross-sex hormone therapy, a prospective observational study, is an article that a lot of transphobes like to throw around in this conversation. Why? Because on a surface level, it can be made to seemingly agree with them. Not only does the study show that the areal bone mineral density, or ABMD, doesn't decrease when a trans woman is put on HRT, it actually shows it increasing. As you might remember, Miles himself mentioned
Denser bones
as one of the key differences between cis and trans women, so that might seem important. But here's the bit they always leave out. ABMD in trans women who are pre-HRT is significantly lower than that in cis men. What's more is the slight gain seen when they're put on estrogen, a hormone known for prolonging bone life far better than testosterone, doesn't close that gap. Most trans women have, and will forever have, a lower ABMD than cis men. So what the hell is going on? Well, differences in social behaviour. Namely the fact that trans women, just like cis women, have a much more sedentary lifestyle than cis men. Society discourages women from pursuing sports, telling them to pursue more sensible careers or even stay at home, particularly around puberty, and there are more opportunities for men athletes than there are women athletes. That has an impact, not just on cis women, but trans women as well. This is an example of why the whole notion of male socialization is so bullshit. A trans woman may not even be aware of why she feels averse to sports, but those feelings can still change something as solid as bone. Though do not despair, not everything is set in stone. Another study looking into fast-twitch muscle fibers in elite women weightlifters found that they had as many, if not more, than their cis men counterparts. Fast-twitch muscle fibers are, of course, important for explosive displays of force, such as those seen in sprinting, weightlifting, and mixed martial arts. Now, the fact that cis women have the same as cis men is believed to be the result of both the selection process for elite sports and years of training. So there are elements that can be overcome, just not by discriminating against trans people. Now, I know I haven't covered everything Miles listed at the start, but the fact is, it's not on me to disprove what Miles has merely asserted, especially when those assertions are reliant on an unproven hypothesis. But what really gets me about this entire thing is just how much Miles exploits his audience's trust in him when he makes claims like these.
I actually have a deep passion for the subject and have done for a while, and I think that mainly comes from not just learning about it, researching about it for the last few years, watching this pan out, but you know, back in the day, I was also in professional sport. I know the difference, trust me, I know the difference, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute, between someone that has grown up in a biological male body with the exposure of all of that testosterone, which gives you so many different advantages, which I'll get to in a minute, versus a biological female. It just can't be compared. It just cannot be compared. It just cannot be compared.
What research? What passion? All you've done in your video is assert your prejudice as fact and claim that those of us actually willing to look at and discuss the evidence are in denial. And this incredulity persists throughout Miles's video with sections like these.
One example that many people have been speaking about recently is Laurel Hubbard. She is a transgender female, a weightlifter, who used to be a professional male weightlifter also, and then decided to transition to being a female, and now is allowed, was even allowed to compete in the Olympics. Didn't win the Olympics, but apparently that was because of some technical thing or timing, or I don't even know what the reason was why she didn't win there. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have a massive advantage. She does, and she's proved it time and time again. Even after whatever kind of therapy she's been going through, she still has 4 times higher levels of testosterone than any natural biological female could produce. Why do you think athletes that cheat with testosterone, whether they're men or women, get banned from sport? Because it gives them a clear, unfair advantage above the rest of the field to have additional and abnormally high levels of testosterone. This is just a biological fact that cannot be undone, and I do not understand how anyone is questioning this. I also do not understand how anyone is watching this happen and staying silent about it, because trust me, it's not just about the Olympics. It goes much further beyond that. Again, normally in sport, anyone that cheats with performance-enhancing drugs such as testosterone gets banned. But transgender females such as Laurel Hubbard, just using her as an example, who have 4 times more testosterone than the females that she's competing against, is allowed to compete against them.
If you don't know and yet you want to talk about the case, how about you fucking find out? The fact that you didn't is why I couldn't include this in your evidence earlier, as you yourself admit you are not qualified to talk about the subject. This is a shocking display of intellectual laziness. I don't expect everyone to know every fact about gender in sports, but you're the one who chose her case. Laurel Hubbard came last in her weight category because she failed to lift her weight 3 times during the first round. It was only a technicality as much as a hurdle racer tripping and stumbling at the first hurdle is a technicality. She was beaten by everyone in her weight category, fair and square, because they were better than her.
She still has 4 times higher levels of testosterone than any natural biological female could produce.
That's just a flat out lie. Not simply because Laurel was forced to reduce her testosterone levels below 10 nanomoles per litre in order to comply with IOC and WA regulations, but as shown earlier in what the IOC Medical and Science Director had to say, there are cis women who have levels of testosterone higher than 10 nanomoles per litre. So where the hell has this 4 times higher bullshit come from? This is just a shocking display of negligence on Miles's part, showing all his mentions of science and biology to be nothing more than hollow lip service, a cover for his cis male mediocrity. I mean, it's not exactly like this is the first time I've encountered such behaviour. But it's not just pseudoscientific. Everything Miles says in his video is also steeped in misogyny. From the way he talks about women at every turn, right down to the fact that the system he's fighting to uphold relies on raping women athletes, you just can't escape it. So let's talk about that. One thing Miles makes a show of throughout his video are his claims to care about cis women, their rights, and how trans inclusivity is apparently a danger to them.
But speaking of ethical and fair, when it comes to something that is blatantly very unfair and unbalanced, and kind of an attack on our own species, and certainly very disrespectful and dangerous towards biological women, people shut their mouths. I can hear crickets going off everywhere. I will always stand up for what's right. I will always stand up for women. You guys, if you don't know by now, I love women, I respect women. I care so much about women. I care so much about sport. I have personal experience with this.
Except, if you actually cared, you wouldn't be arguing in support of a system which is not only used to police women's gender expression, but is also intrinsically linked to the rape and sexual assault of women athletes. Whilst both the IOC and WA did away with mandatory sex testing after the end of the Cold War, due to it being viewed as a dehumanizing practice that violated numerous human rights, they somehow got away with retaining the authority to perform what are known as suspicion-based sex tests. Athletes are judged by how well they fit Western notions of femininity established by the patriarchal state, with those seen to transgress said invented gender roles being accused of having lied about their gender. This is not only entirely sexist, but it also means that not all women are targeted equally, with the vast majority of victims belonging to the global south. This is especially true of black women who suffer a form of bigotry known as misogyny, literally misogyny intersected with anti-black racism, a big part of which is the way in which it characterizes black women's bodies as inherently masculine. That's why almost all victims of suspicion-based sex testing over the past 2 decades have been black, with a few exceptions being dark-skinned South Asians. Now, most people think sex testing involves taking either a blood or urine sample, which is then tested in a lab, and that's really it. Even if that were the case, it would still be invasive as the urine sample has to be obtained while the individual is being watched to ensure no tampering, something that has invited genital scrutiny towards mostly black women. This would be bad enough, but it gets worse than that. You see, hormones are a 2-part system. On one hand, you have hormone production, whilst on the other, you have hormone utilization. People with differences in sexual development, such as those with androgen sensitivity, produce testosterone in quantities comparable to cis men, yet their body can't use it. Meanwhile, others, such as those with hyperandrogenism, both produce and utilize the hormone. Now, how do sporting bodies check which one a person has? Well, they threaten the athlete with being barred from her professional career unless she allows a physician to check her clitoris. This is the official World Athletics policy. This is the cornerstone of keeping both trans and intersex women out of sport. It is also a human rights violation, with Human Rights Watch going so far as to compare it to the barbaric practice of virginity testing. And it's hard to argue with that. This sickening violation of bodily autonomy is nothing more than another form of purity testing. Only instead of looking for evidence of virginity, they're looking for evidence of womanhood, reducing a woman down to little more than how her body utilizes its natural testosterone. So, what does that mean when Miles makes arguments like these?
Critical thinking and speaking up for what's right in 2021 is a lost talent, and I feel like it's getting worse by the day. It's very funny how in recent years, not funny, I mean it's understandable that there's been so much emphasis on the protection and the support and the understanding of transgender people, again, which I respect. But what about the protection and the understanding and the fairness towards biological females? What about that? All of you feminists who are constantly speaking up about issues and, you know, rights for females and all of that, when it comes to this sport issue, everyone's silent. It's really sad as well that so many top female athletes are afraid of speaking up about this because they're afraid of losing their contracts, they're afraid of being cancelled, they're afraid of being called transphobic. Again, it's none of those things. It's just about fairness. It is just about fairness at the end of the day. I've just touched the basics in this video, and I should think that even just with knowing that, that's enough for anyone, especially females, if you care about the protection of your own beings and your fellow biological females in sport, raise your voice. Now is the time to speak up.
It means that Miles is effectively demanding to know why feminists aren't fighting to uphold systems which are not only used to police women, but as justification to rape them. The fact is, elite athletes have been speaking on the matter. Hundreds of them, including greats such as Billie Jean King, Megan Rapinoe and Cadence Parker. Not to forget the entire Women's Sports Foundation, and every single one of them speaks in support of trans women. Returning to Laurel Hubbard, when her participation in the Olympics this year was announced, her Australian rival Charisma Omo-Tarrant told the papers,
I have so much respect for her and wish her and the other lifters the best and hope we can all come together and enjoy the Olympics, because this Olympics right now is quite different compared to others. I've competed with her previously and always had good chats with her. I just wish her well.
So women athletes are talking. Miles just isn't listening. He feels like he has the right to tell women how they should act and feel. That's why there's so much venom in his voice when he says, "All you feminists." Because he can't handle women having an opinion that doesn't support his prejudicial hatred towards trans people. He only cares about women as part of a narrative to justify his bigotry. That's where the concern starts and ends. This is a form of sexism known as benevolent sexism or benevolent patriarchy, a set of beliefs that add up to the notion that women are all these fragile, childlike entities who are incapable of protecting themselves and therefore require men to do so for them. It is a frequent hallmark of fascism, imperialism, and similar far-right ideologies who like to use the socially constructed notion of female fragility as a means of justifying their violence towards marginalized groups. And the unifying theory behind said ideologies: women are a precious resource or commodity to be guarded with extreme jealousy. Benevolent sexism strips women of their autonomy and right to self-determination. It's men mansplaining to feminists how women need to act in order to remain safe. That's why statements like,
"This is about the protection of biological females,"
sound as if they came directly from the mouth of a neo-Nazi recruiter. Post 9/11, the mantra of protecting our women became a staple of the far right across the UK and the US in relation to what they claimed was a pending Muslim invasion. This is how they pushed Brexit through, in spite of having little to nothing to do with Middle Eastern refugees. It's not a coincidence that UKIP chose a photo that showed mostly Middle Eastern men. The far right weaponized a moral panic to create the illusion that they actually cared about women, when all they really cared about was hurting Muslims. Before 9/11, it was the myth of black criminality personified in the caricature of the black mugger, and more recently they've latched onto the moral panic surrounding trans people to do the same. That's the train of hate that Miles is feeding his audience into. And Miles is fully aware of the fact that he is engaging in benevolent sexism with this argument. After all, why would he go out of his way to assert that
"This is about the protection of biological females"? This is not about me trying to prove a point. This is not about men. This is not about equality between men and women. This is nothing to do with that.
Unless some part of him realized that he was being a sexist mouthpiece. Fact is, there are very real issues to get angry about when it comes to women's sports. Predatory coaches, lack of funding, society treating women's sports like a joke. Or how about the facts that World Athletics experimented on black women at the start of the 2010s to try and prove that testosterone was the key deciding factor when it came to athletic prowess. Long story short, a team of doctors, including Dr. Berman, yes, that Dr. Berman, coerced a group of intersex athletes from, quote, rural or mountainous regions of developing countries, end quote, into undergoing unnecessary gonadectomies before being denied vital aftercare. Said team then used the medical trauma their malpractice resulted in as evidence of the powers of testosterone, only to be publicly called out on it and for the evidence to be abandoned at the preliminary stage. Though Dr. Berman did reference it in his 2017 attempt to justify the WA's official policy on trans and intersex athletes. Because of course he did. Now, two of the women have come forward since then to speak about their experiences. One of them, former Ugandan runner Annette Negasa, was so certain that she'd die as a result of what was done to her that she returned to her home village with the intention of passing away there. Meanwhile, another woman, who has chosen to remain anonymous for obvious reasons, describes a near-identical experience in which she was left wishing she had died on the operating table. Fact is, I know Miles at least pretends to care about intersex people. After all, he attempts to blame the trans community for what was done to Caster Semenya.
The more I learn, know, and think about this, the more it actually frustrates me, because there's also another case. I'm sure a lot of you know of the very famous South African, I think she's South African, I apologise to her if she's not, Caster Semenya. She was an incredible 400 metre and 800 metre runner, who is, I believe, an Olympic gold medalist. She's a biological female. I do believe that she has some kind of, I don't want to call it a defect because that kind of sounds rude or disrespectful, but she has a medical condition where her body is producing more testosterone than the average biological female. For that reason, she has been banned from competing against females. But people that grew up in biological male bodies are allowed to compete with much higher levels of testosterone and completely smash the field when it comes to sport.
They're called differences in sexual development, and people with them are called intersex. This is basic information you've messed up on, meaning that, once again, you've proven yourself to be wholly unequipped to talk about the topic. But returning to my original point, there is very real harm being done against women athletes that Miles could be calling out. Instead, he's chosen to spend his time creating this video demonizing trans people. Speaking of which, Caster wasn't banned from competing, at least not outright as you imply. She was put under stricter regulations similar to those put on trans women, regulations that negatively impacted her health to the point that she refused to endure them, risking her entire career in the process. That's how dehumanizing the sex testing and hormone policing is for all participants, both trans and cis, because their struggles are linked. When Caster Semenya rose to challenge the harsher restrictions on intersex athletes introduced in 2018, the way the WA fought back was to conflate intersex athletes with trans athletes. That's not my opinion, that's a fact noted in a 2020 report by Human Rights Watch. When push came to shove, the WA justified medical violence against Semenya by turning to all the fear and transphobia you have propagated throughout your video. So we're not the problem here, you are. And it's time for you to fucking own up to that fact as we move into our last section discussing rather visible examples of Miles's transphobia. However, I'm rather conscious about the time and don't want this video to become feature length. I still have a lot to say, especially on this image, which, spoiler, is faked. On top of that, there's a language Miles has used throughout his video, his targeting a trans youth on multiple accounts, his selective empathy, and his constant usage of Nazi talking points whilst also encouraging his audience to watch literal Nazis. Something that's not only setting off red flags, but red, white and black flags. We're gonna have to do a part 2 to this response. So be sure to subscribe and stick around for that. I'll put a link in the description to part 2 when that's out, meaning it's probably already down there if you're joining the party late. With that noted, I just wanted to ask you all a few questions. What do you think of the situation so far? Why do so many people seemingly allergic to actual science pretend like it's on their side? Do you agree with my observation that Miles is displaying signs of benevolent patriarchy? Did I miss something you glorious bastards noticed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Just understand that abuse won't make it through. If you like what we do here, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gerrit Van Voorst, Zoe and Katie, Cthulhu, and Sosh Daniels. And for myself, Udita and Levi, take care now.